Imagine a man sitting in a dark room. He is a slave. His master, in a fit of cruel boredom, begins to twist his leg. The man doesn't scream. He doesn't beg. He simply looks at his master and says, "You will break it." Moments later, the bone snaps. The man looks down at his ruined limb and calmly remarks, "Did I not tell you it would break?" This was Epictetus. How did a man in chains become so powerful that even pain couldn't touch him? Tonight, we learn the secret that turned a slave into the teacher of emperors. Picture, if you will, the dusty marketplace of ancient Hierapolis, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, their futures determined by the weight of coins changing hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as merchants arranged their wares, and among the most precious of these commodities stood rows of trembling figures awaiting their fate. The air was thick with the scent of spices, leather, and human sweat, punctuated by the harsh voices of auctioneers calling out prices and the muffled sobs of children torn from their families. Among these tragic figures stood a small boy whose name would one day echo through the halls of philosophy schools across the Roman Empire, though at this moment he possessed nothing that the world valued: no freedom, no family name, no inheritance, no hope of education or advancement. Yet within his mind burned the spark of something that no master could own, no chains could bind, and no cruelty could extinguish. This child, born into bondage around 55 years after the death of Christ, would grow to become one of history's most powerful voices for human freedom and dignity, proving that the most profound forms of liberation cannot be granted or taken away by external forces but must be won through the disciplined development of inner strength and wisdom. His name was Epictetus, though even this simple designation carries with it the bitter irony of his circumstances. The Greek word epiktetos means acquired or gained, a name that marked him not as an individual with inherent worth and unlimited potential, but as property to be possessed, used, and discarded at will. It was a label that reduced a human soul to the status of an object, a reminder that, in the eyes of Roman law, he was no different from a piece of furniture or a farming tool. Yet this boy, whose very name proclaimed his enslavement, would grow to become one of history's most eloquent defenders of human dignity and one of its most effective teachers of practical wisdom for daily life. The world into which Epictetus was born was one of staggering contrasts, where the marble palaces of the wealthy rose above the squalid quarters of the enslaved, where senators debated philosophy in perfumed halls while human beings toiled in chains beneath the scorching Mediterranean sun. The Roman Empire of the first century had reached its zenith of power and cultural sophistication, its legions having conquered territories stretching from the misty forests of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria, from the Rhine frontier in Germany to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt. Roman engineering had created roads, aqueducts, and buildings that seemed destined to last forever, while Roman law had established principles of justice and governance that would influence legal systems for millennia to come. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization lay a foundation built upon the backs of millions of enslaved people, whose labor made possible the leisure and luxury that the free citizens enjoyed. The very monuments to Roman greatness, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the vast network of roads and aqueducts, had been constructed by human beings who possessed no rights, no legal protection, and no hope of benefiting from the civilization they were building with their own hands. To understand the magnitude of what Epictetus would eventually achieve, we must first grasp the utterly hopeless nature of his beginning and the complete absence of any reasonable expectation that his life could ever be different from the millions of other anonymous enslaved people who lived and died in service to their masters. Slavery in the Roman world was not merely an economic institution, but a complete system of human degradation that penetrated every aspect of society, from the highest levels of imperial administration to the most intimate details of family life. Enslaved people were considered property under Roman law, with no rights to marriage, family, or personal possessions. They could be bought, sold, beaten, sexually exploited, or killed at their master's whim. They had no legal recourse against abuse, no access to education unless it served their owner's interests, and no expectation that their children might ever know freedom. The law treated them as speaking tools, more valuable than ordinary implements because they could think and communicate, but fundamentally no different in terms of legal status. The psychological dimensions of slavery were perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. The system was designed not merely to extract labor but to break the spirit, to convince the enslaved that they were naturally inferior and deserving of their fate. Masters used sophisticated techniques of psychological control, alternating between brutality and kindness, isolation and conditional acceptance, in ways calculated to create dependency and prevent the development of autonomous identity or self-respect. The boy who would become Epictetus was born in Hierapolis, a prosperous city in the Roman province of Phrygia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey. Hierapolis was famous throughout the empire for its hot springs, which were believed to possess healing properties, and for its thriving textile industry that produced some of the finest wool and silk in the Mediterranean world. It was a place where merchants from across the empire came to trade not only in luxury goods but in human flesh, making it one of the major slave markets of the eastern provinces. The city's strategic location on major trade routes meant that it was a cosmopolitan place, filled with people speaking dozens of languages and representing cultures from across the known world. Greek remained the language of education and culture, while Latin was the language of administration and law. But in the markets and workshops, one could hear Aramaic, Armenian, Persian, Egyptian, and countless other tongues as traders, craftsmen, and laborers from every corner of the empire pursued their various occupations. It was in this diverse but hierarchical environment that the future philosopher spent his earliest years, absorbing through daily observation the complex realities of human nature and social organization. Even as a child, he would have witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior, kindness and cruelty, wisdom and folly, courage and cowardice, in ways that provided a comprehensive education in the possibilities and limitations of human character. We know frustratingly little about his earliest years, for history rarely troubled itself to record the childhood experiences of enslaved people. Their lives were considered too insignificant to merit documentation unless they somehow served the interests of their masters or affected the lives of free citizens. What we do know is that sometime during his youth, probably while still a child, he was sold to a freedman named Epaphroditus, who served as secretary to the Emperor Nero. This transition from one master to another might have seemed like a minor change in circumstances to outside observers, but it would prove to be the turning point that made everything else possible. For it was through this sale that a provincial slave boy found himself transported to Rome, the beating heart of the civilized world, where he would encounter intellectual and cultural influences that would transform not only his own life, but the lives of countless others throughout history. Epaphroditus was not just any freedman, but one of the most powerful individuals in the Roman Empire. As Nero's trusted secretary and confidant, he controlled access to the emperor and managed much of the vast bureaucracy that administered the known world. His position required him to be literate in multiple languages, knowledgeable about law and administration, and skilled in the delicate art of imperial politics. He was, in modern terms, something like a combination of chief of staff, press secretary, and national security advisor to the most powerful person on earth. His household in Rome was a microcosm of the empire itself, filled with enslaved people from every corner of the known world who had been selected for their various skills and talents. There were Greeks valued for their education and cultural sophistication, Gauls prized for their physical strength and military experience, Germans sought for their loyalty and fierce courage, Syrians appreciated for their commercial acumen and linguistic abilities, Egyptians treasured for their mathematical and engineering knowledge, and countless others who had been torn from their homelands to serve the needs of their Roman masters. It was in this extraordinarily cosmopolitan environment that young Epictetus first encountered the intellectual ferment that characterized Roman high society during the reign of Nero. Unlike many enslaved people who were condemned to lives of pure physical labor in mines, fields, or workshops, those who served in wealthy households often had opportunities to observe and occasionally participate in the cultural and intellectual life of their masters. The boy from Hierapolis would have heard conversations about literature, politics, philosophy, and religion conducted in multiple languages by some of the most educated and influential people in the empire. He would have been exposed to poetry recitations, philosophical discussions, political debates, and artistic performances that represented the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. Even more importantly, he would have observed how these same sophisticated individuals behaved when they thought no one was watching, gaining insights into the gap between public virtue and private character that would later become central to his philosophical teaching. Yet, even as his mind was being exposed to new ideas and possibilities that most enslaved people never encountered, his body was enduring the harsh realities of his legal status as human property. The daily routine of an enslaved person in a wealthy Roman household involved long hours of demanding physical labor, constant surveillance and control, and the ever-present threat of punishment for any perceived failure or disobedience. At some point during his youth, Epictetus suffered an injury that left him permanently lame in one leg, a disability that would affect his mobility for the rest of his life. The exact cause of this injury has been debated by historians for centuries, and the uncertainty surrounding it reflects the general lack of reliable information about the personal experiences of enslaved people in the ancient world. Some ancient sources suggest it was the result of deliberate cruelty by his master or an overseer, while others indicate it might have been caused by disease, accident, or gradual deterioration from harsh working conditions. One particularly poignant account, though possibly apocryphal, tells of a young Epictetus calmly warning his master that continued twisting of his leg would break it, and when the bone finally snapped, simply observing with philosophical detachment, "See, I told you it would break." Whether this specific story is literally true or not, it captures something essential about the character that Epictetus was already developing even in his youth. Rather than being broken psychologically by physical suffering and the constant humiliation of his enslaved status, he was learning to observe both his external circumstances and his internal responses with a kind of philosophical detachment that would later become the cornerstone of his teaching. The physical pain and limitation that might have driven others to despair, rage, or bitter resentment were becoming, for him, opportunities to develop the inner strength and emotional resilience that no external force could touch. He was discovering, through direct personal experience, that while others might control his body and his external circumstances, his mind and his responses remained fundamentally his own. The Rome in which Epictetus spent his formative years was a city of unimaginable grandeur and equally unimaginable cruelty, a place where human achievement reached extraordinary heights while human degradation plumbed appalling depths. The capital of the known world sprawled across its 7 hills, home to over 1 million people from every corner of the empire, making it by far the largest city that had ever existed in human history. Marble temples gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, their columns and pediments representing the pinnacle of architectural achievement and artistic beauty. The forum bustled with merchants, politicians, philosophers, and curious visitors from around the world, creating a constant cacophony of languages, accents, and commercial activity. The Circus Maximus could seat 250,000 spectators for chariot races and other entertainments, while the growing number of public baths, theaters, and libraries provided centers for social life and cultural enrichment. The aqueduct system that brought fresh water from distant mountains was an engineering marvel that supplied the city with more clean water per capita than many modern cities would achieve. The road network radiating out from the capital connected every corner of the empire in a communications and transportation system that would not be equaled for more than a millennium after Rome's fall. Yet this same city that produced some of humanity's greatest achievements in art, literature, law, and engineering was also the beating heart of an empire built on systematic exploitation and casual violence. The gladiatorial games that entertained the masses featured human beings fighting and dying for sport, often in elaborate spectacles designed to maximize both the carnage and the crowd's bloodlust. Public executions were common spectacles along the major roads leading into the city, often involving elaborate tortures designed not only to punish the condemned but to terrorize potential opposition to Roman rule. Enslaved people who attempted escape were crucified as warnings to others who might consider rebellion, their broken bodies left to rot in full view of travelers entering the imperial capital. The contrast between magnificent public buildings and the squalid living conditions of the poor was stark and deliberate. While wealthy Romans lived in palatial houses with elaborate gardens, private baths, and every luxury that money could buy, the majority of the city's population was crowded into dangerous, unsanitary tenement buildings that regularly collapsed or burned, killing hundreds at a time. It was against this backdrop of magnificent achievement and terrible brutality that Epictetus began to develop the philosophical insights that would eventually transform not only his own life but the lives of countless others throughout history. The contradictions of Roman society provided the young enslaved person with a living laboratory for understanding the complexities of human nature, the relationship between power and character, and the possibilities for finding meaning and dignity even in the most oppressive circumstances. The intellectual awakening of Epictetus likely began during his teenage years with his exposure to Stoicism, the philosophical school that had been growing in influence throughout the Roman world since its founding in Athens 3 centuries earlier. Stoicism was particularly appealing to Romans because of its practical emphasis and its compatibility with traditional Roman values of duty, self-discipline, honor, and service to the state. Leading Roman intellectuals like Seneca the Younger, who served as advisor to Nero during the early years of his reign, had already begun adapting Stoic principles to the realities of imperial governance and aristocratic life. Seneca's letters and essays demonstrated how ancient philosophical wisdom could be applied to the practical challenges faced by busy executives, ambitious politicians, and thoughtful citizens trying to live ethically in a complex and often corrupt society. But for an enslaved person, Stoicism offered something even more precious than philosophical sophistication or social respectability. It offered a path to inner freedom that no master could control, a form of dignity that no legal system could strip away, and a source of strength that no amount of physical suffering could diminish. The central Stoic teaching that happiness and peace come not from external circumstances but from our responses to those circumstances was nothing short of revolutionary for someone whose external circumstances were entirely determined by others. The idea that virtue was the only true good, and that virtue was equally available to all human beings regardless of their social status, wealth, education, or circumstances, provided a philosophical foundation for maintaining self-respect and purpose even in the most degrading conditions. Even more importantly, the Stoic emphasis on rational analysis and emotional discipline provided practical tools for managing the psychological challenges of enslavement without losing hope or humanity. The young Epictetus would have first encountered Stoic ideas through the conversations and intellectual activities of his master's household. Epaphroditus, as one of Nero's closest advisors, was certainly familiar with the philosophical schools that influenced Roman political and cultural life. The household likely contained a substantial library with works by earlier Stoic philosophers as well as more contemporary authors like Seneca. Educated enslaved people were often used to read aloud to their masters during meals or leisure time, to serve as scribes and secretaries for correspondence and literary work, and to assist with various intellectual projects. Through these activities, Epictetus would have been exposed not only to the theoretical content of Stoic philosophy, but to the ongoing debates about how these principles could be applied to contemporary challenges and controversies. He would have observed how wealthy and powerful Romans used philosophical ideas to justify their actions, to cope with setbacks and disappointments, and to maintain their composure and effectiveness in high-pressure situations. More importantly, he would have seen the gap that often existed between philosophical profession and actual behavior, gaining insights into the challenges of authentic character development that would later inform his own teaching. The assassination of Nero in 68 CE marked a dramatic turning point not only in Roman history, but in the personal life of Epictetus. The emperor's death was followed by the chaotic Year of the Four Emperors, during which the empire nearly tore itself apart as rival claimants battled for control of the throne. Epaphroditus, who had been instrumental in Nero's final downfall, found his own position precarious and dangerous under the new regime. It was during this period of political upheaval and uncertainty that Epictetus somehow obtained his freedom, though the exact circumstances of his manumission remain unclear. He may have been formally freed by Epaphroditus as a reward for loyal service, or his freedom might have come through the political chaos that followed Nero's death. Some sources suggest that he purchased his own freedom, though how an enslaved person could have acquired the necessary funds remains a mystery. Freedom, for a former enslaved person in the Roman world, was both a tremendous blessing and a significant challenge. While no longer property, freedmen occupied an ambiguous position in Roman society, legally free but still marked by their servile origins, possessing certain rights but remaining excluded from many opportunities available to freeborn citizens. Many freedmen used their new status to pursue wealth and social advancement, often becoming successful merchants, craftsmen, or administrators who eventually achieved respectability and influence despite their humble origins. But Epictetus chose a different path entirely. Rather than seeking material success or social advancement, he decided to dedicate his life to the study and teaching of philosophy, pursuing wisdom and virtue as ends in themselves rather than as means to conventional success. This choice reflected both his growing understanding of what truly mattered in life and his recognition that his own experiences had given him unique insights into the human condition that could benefit others. He began studying under Musonius Rufus, one of the leading Stoic teachers of the time and a philosopher whose own life exemplified the courage and integrity that Stoicism demanded. Musonius was known for his practical approach to philosophy, his willingness to challenge conventional Roman attitudes about slavery, women's equality, marriage, and social justice, and his insistence that philosophical principles be lived rather than merely discussed. Under Musonius's guidance, Epictetus developed not only a sophisticated understanding of Stoic theory, but also the pedagogical skills that would later make him one of history's most effective philosophy teachers. He learned how to identify the specific psychological patterns and emotional habits that created suffering for individuals, how to design targeted interventions that could help people change these patterns, and how to create learning environments that supported genuine transformation rather than mere intellectual understanding. The philosophical education that Epictetus received went far beyond the study of texts and theories. Ancient Stoicism was a comprehensive way of life that involved training in logic, ethics, and physics, their term for understanding the natural world and humanity's place within it. Students learn to analyze their own thought patterns, to identify and challenge irrational beliefs and dysfunctional emotional habits, and to develop practical wisdom through systematic practice and regular self-examination. Logic was taught not as abstract reasoning, but as a tool for clear thinking about moral and practical decisions. Students learn to identify fallacies and biases in their own thinking, to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information, and to construct sound arguments based on evidence rather than emotion or wishful thinking. Ethics was not a theoretical study of right and wrong, but a systematic training in virtue and wise action. Students practiced making moral decisions in hypothetical scenarios, examined the consequences of different choices, and developed the emotional strength necessary for acting on their principles even when it was difficult or costly to do so. Physics involved understanding the natural order of the universe and recognizing humanity's place within the larger cosmic system. This included accepting the reality of change, loss, and death as natural processes rather than evils to be resisted, and finding meaning and purpose through harmony with natural law rather than futile attempts to control what was beyond human power. Throughout his years of study, Epictetus was developing not only his philosophical understanding but also his distinctive teaching style. Unlike many philosophers who relied primarily on formal lectures and abstract discussions, he was developing an approach that was highly interactive, personally challenging, and focused on practical application rather than theoretical sophistication. His later teachings would be characterized by vivid analogies drawn from everyday life, practical exercises designed to develop specific aspects of character and judgment, and direct confrontations with students' self-deceptions and rationalizations. He had learned through his own experience that real philosophical transformation required more than intellectual understanding. It demanded emotional honesty, sustained effort, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about oneself. As his reputation as both a student and developing teacher grew, Epictetus began to attract attention from other intellectuals and from wealthy Romans interested in philosophy. The transformation of the former enslaved person into a respected philosophical voice was remarkable enough to be noted by his contemporaries. Here was living proof that wisdom and virtue were not limited to those born into privilege and education, but were available to anyone willing to undertake the demanding work of philosophical practice. This growing recognition brought both opportunities and dangers. The philosophical schools of Rome existed in a complex political environment where ideas could quickly become controversial and teachers could find themselves caught up in conflicts between competing factions and interests. The emphasis on virtue, rational thought, and moral independence that characterized Stoic philosophy could easily be interpreted as implicit criticism of imperial policies or court practices. However, this period of relative tolerance and opportunity was not destined to last. When Domitian became emperor in 81 CE, the political atmosphere in Rome began to change dramatically. Domitian was increasingly paranoid and deeply suspicious of anyone who might pose a challenge to his authority, real or imagined. Philosophers, with their emphasis on virtue over power and their commitment to principles that transcended political expediency, were particularly suspect in his eyes. The growing tension between philosophical teaching and imperial politics came to a dramatic head in 89 CE when Domitian issued a decree expelling all philosophers from Rome and Italy. This sweeping order was motivated by his fear that philosophical schools were breeding grounds for political opposition and that teachers who emphasized virtue and rational thought were undermining respect for imperial authority. For Epictetus, now established as one of Rome's leading philosophy teachers, the expulsion decree meant the end of his career in the imperial capital and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in his life. Rather than being seen as a devastating setback, however, The forced exile became an opportunity to put Stoic principles into practice. His philosophical training had taught him to focus on what he could control while accepting what he could not change, and the expulsion was simply another external circumstance that required adaptation rather than resistance. He decided to establish his new school in Nicopolis, a city in northwestern Greece that had been founded by Augustus to commemorate his victory at the Battle of Actium. Nicopolis was strategically located on the main route between Rome and the eastern provinces, making it easily accessible to students from throughout the empire while remaining far enough from the imperial capital to be safe from immediate political interference. The choice of Nicopolis proved to be inspired in multiple ways. The city had been designed as a showcase of Roman culture and Greek learning, with beautiful public buildings, an excellent harbor, and a strategic location that made it a natural center for trade and cultural exchange. More importantly, the political situation in Greece was more relaxed than in Italy, providing an environment where philosophical education could flourish without constant concern about imperial suspicion. Establishing a new school in a foreign city required enormous energy, resourcefulness, and determination. Epictetus had to find suitable facilities for teaching and housing students, attract an initial group of learners willing to travel to an unfamiliar location, develop a comprehensive curriculum, hire additional teachers and staff, and create all the institutional structures necessary for sustained educational activity. The fact that he not only succeeded in these practical challenges, but created what became one of the most influential philosophy schools of the ancient world testifies to his remarkable combination of wisdom, practical ability, leadership skills, and sheer determination. His success also demonstrated the hunger that existed throughout the Roman Empire for authentic philosophical education that could provide practical guidance for living well in challenging times. The school that Epictetus established in Nicopolis was quite different from the typical Roman educational institution of the time. Rather than focusing primarily on rhetoric and literature as preparation for political careers, his school was designed to transform character and develop practical wisdom. Students came not just to acquire knowledge or polish their speaking skills, but to undergo a systematic process of personal development that touched every aspect of their lives. The curriculum was built around the three main areas of Stoic study: logic, ethics, and physics, but these were approached as practical disciplines for living rather than merely academic subjects. Students learned that philosophy was not an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that required constant practice and continuous effort. Logic was taught as a tool for clear thinking about moral and practical decisions rather than as an abstract system of rules. Students learned to identify the assumptions and biases that influence their judgments, to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information, and to construct sound arguments based on evidence and reasoning rather than emotion or wishful thinking. Ethics was approached as a systematic training in virtue and wise action rather than a theoretical study of right and wrong. Students engaged in regular moral exercises, examined case studies of ethical dilemmas, and practiced making principled decisions under pressure. They learned that virtue was not just a set of rules to follow, but a practical capacity for choosing and acting wisely in any circumstances. Physics involved understanding the natural order of the universe and recognizing humanity's place within the larger cosmic system. This included accepting the reality of change, loss, and death as natural processes rather than evils to be resisted, and finding meaning and purpose through harmony with natural law rather than futile attempts to control what was beyond human power. The daily routine at the school reflected Epictetus's belief that philosophy must be lived, not just studied. Students began each day with morning reflections designed to prepare them mentally and morally for whatever challenges they might face. They engaged in regular self-examination, honestly assessing their thoughts, emotions, and actions against philosophical standards. They practiced specific exercises designed to develop emotional resilience, moral courage, and intellectual clarity. The teaching methods that Epictetus employed were innovative, highly effective, and remarkably modern in their psychological sophistication. Rather than delivering formal lectures to passive audiences, he typically engaged in dialogue with individual students or small groups, using questions and challenges to help them discover insights for themselves rather than simply absorbing information presented by authority figures. He was masterful at identifying each student's particular weaknesses, blind spots, and self-deceptions, then designing exercises and experiences specifically tailored to address these individual issues. His approach was simultaneously compassionate and demanding, supportive and challenging, recognizing that genuine growth required both emotional safety and intellectual honesty. One of his most distinctive teaching techniques involved the use of what he called disciplines, systematic practices designed to train specific aspects of character and judgment. The discipline of desire taught students to want only what was truly good and actually available to them, rather than constantly struggling against reality or pursuing goals that were ultimately beyond their control. The discipline of action helped them learn to act appropriately in various situations while maintaining their moral principles, regardless of external pressure or personal cost. The discipline of assent trained them to give or withhold agreement to impressions and ideas based on careful rational evaluation rather than automatic emotional reaction. These disciplines were not mere intellectual exercises but practical training programs that required daily effort and constant attention. Students learned to observe their own mental processes with the same objectivity they might apply to external events, creating the psychological distance necessary for making wise choices rather than simply reacting automatically to whatever stimuli they encountered. The student body at Nicopolis was remarkably diverse, reflecting both the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman Empire and the universal appeal of Epictetus's teaching. Young Roman aristocrats came to prepare themselves for political careers, seeking the moral foundation and practical wisdom that would make them effective and ethical leaders capable of serving the public good rather than merely advancing their personal interests. Military officers arrived hoping to develop the courage, judgment, and emotional resilience necessary for command responsibilities, particularly the ability to maintain moral principles and clear thinking under the extreme pressures of warfare and crisis leadership. Merchants and craftsmen sought guidance for managing the ethical challenges of business life, learning how to pursue prosperity while maintaining integrity and contributing to the welfare of their communities rather than simply maximizing personal profit. Ordinary citizens came seeking practical tools for managing family relationships, financial pressures, health challenges, and the countless other difficulties that characterized daily life for most people in the ancient world. Among the most significant students who came to Nicopolis was a young Roman historian and future military commander named Arrian, who would play a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Epictetus's teachings to future generations. Arrian was already an accomplished writer and intellectual when he arrived at the school, but he was so impressed by his teacher's wisdom, character, and effectiveness that he decided to dedicate himself to recording and preserving Epictetus's words for posterity. Arrian's decision to record his teacher's words was not merely an academic exercise or an attempt to advance his own literary career, but a labor of love born from his recognition that Epictetus possessed insights that could benefit countless future students of philosophy. He attended lectures faithfully, took detailed notes of classroom discussions, and eventually compiled these into the collection known as the Discourses, our primary source for understanding Epictetus's teaching and one of the most vivid and practical guides to Stoic philosophy that has survived from the ancient world. The teaching style that Arrian captured in his records was highly distinctive and remarkably modern in its psychological sophistication. Epictetus had an uncanny ability to identify the specific mental habits, emotional patterns, and behavioral tendencies that caused suffering for individual students. He would then design targeted interventions, combinations of rational analysis, practical exercises, and moral challenge to help them develop healthier and more effective ways of thinking and responding. Many of his interventions focused on what he saw as the root cause of most human suffering, the tendency to confuse what is up to us with what is not up to us. Students learned to identify clearly what aspects of any situation were under their direct control and which were not, then to focus their energy and attention exclusively on what they could actually influence. This fundamental distinction became the foundation for all other aspects of Stoic practice. Students discovered that while they could not control external events, other people's choices, or even their own initial emotional reactions, they retained complete authority over their responses, their interpretations, their decisions, and their actions. This realization was often profoundly liberating for people who had been exhausting themselves trying to control circumstances beyond their power. The school's approach to ethics was equally practical and psychologically astute. Rather than focusing primarily on abstract moral principles or elaborate philosophical theories, Epictetus taught his students to identify and examine the value judgments that guided their actual behavior. He helped them recognize how conventional social values, the pursuit of wealth, status, pleasure, and approval, often led to anxiety, disappointment, and moral compromise. Students learned to distinguish between conventional goods, which were external to themselves and ultimately unreliable, and what Epictetus called the only true good virtue or excellence of character. This virtue was not an abstract ideal but a practical capacity for choosing and acting wisely in any circumstances. It was something that could be developed through training and practice, and once achieved, it could never be lost or taken away by external forces. The training in virtue was systematic and comprehensive, addressing every aspect of human character and behavior. Students practiced courage not just in dramatic circumstances like warfare or physical danger, but in the small daily choices that revealed and shaped character: the courage to tell the truth when it was uncomfortable, to admit mistakes when pride urged concealment, to stand up for principles when it was socially or professionally costly to do so. They developed justice not only in their treatment of others, but in their honest assessment of their own thoughts, motivations, and actions. This involved learning to see themselves and their situations clearly, without the distortions created by ego, wishful thinking, or social conditioning. Justice meant giving everyone their due, including oneself, which required understanding what was truly owed rather than what was merely desired or conventionally expected. They cultivated temperance not just in their consumption of food, drink, and material pleasures, but in their emotional responses to praise, criticism, success, and failure. Temperance meant finding the appropriate middle ground in all things, avoiding both excess and deficiency in their reactions and behaviors. This required developing sensitivity to context and circumstances while maintaining consistent principles and values. Perhaps most importantly, they learned wisdom, the ability to see situations clearly without the distortions created by fear, desire, anger, or ego. This wisdom involved understanding the true nature of things, recognizing what was truly important and what was merely conventional, and responding to circumstances with appropriate rather than reactive emotions. Wisdom was the master virtue that guided and coordinated all the others. The social dynamics within the school were carefully managed to support this process of character development and moral education. Epictetus created an environment where students felt safe to examine their own weaknesses honestly while being challenged to grow beyond their current limitations. The diversity of the student body was actually an advantage in this process, as it exposed everyone to different perspectives and life experiences while demonstrating the universal nature of human challenges and possibilities. Students from different social backgrounds learned to recognize their common humanity beneath the artificial distinctions created by wealth, status, nationality, and cultural background. Former slaves studied alongside aristocrats, merchants learned from military officers, and provincial newcomers shared insights with cosmopolitan Romans. This mixing of backgrounds and experiences helped everyone develop empathy, humility, and appreciation for the diverse ways that wisdom and virtue could be expressed. The relationship between Epictetus and his students was complex and multifaceted, combining elements that were simultaneously paternal, pedagogical, therapeutic, and spiritual. He was simultaneously teacher, mentor, counselor, and moral guide, but he was also a fellow student on the path of philosophical development. Unlike many ancient philosophers who maintained formal distance from their students or claimed to have achieved perfect wisdom, he was deeply involved in his students' personal development and genuinely cared about their success and well-being. Yet he was also demanding and sometimes harsh in his challenges to their complacency, self-deception, and half-hearted efforts. Students quickly learned that Epictetus would not accept excuses, rationalizations, or superficial compliance. He had lived through circumstances far more difficult than anything they were likely to face, and he expected them to meet their own challenges with comparable courage, honesty, and determination. This combination of compassion and high expectations created an environment where rapid personal growth was not only possible but almost inevitable. The intellectual atmosphere at the school was rigorous and stimulating, but always grounded in practical application rather than abstract theorizing. Students engaged in regular debates and discussions that challenged them to defend their positions logically and to consider alternative perspectives seriously. Epictetus encouraged them to read widely and to engage with other philosophical traditions, not to become eclectic in their approach, but to understand more clearly the distinctive advantages and coherence of Stoic philosophy. Physical training was also an important component of the educational program, reflecting Epictetus's belief that the body and mind were intimately connected and that physical discipline supported moral and intellectual development. Students engaged in regular exercise, learned to endure discomfort without complaint, and practiced voluntary exposure to challenging conditions as preparation for maintaining their equanimity when facing involuntary hardships. The role of suffering and adversity in education was a constant theme in Epictetus's teaching, and one that he was uniquely qualified to address given his own life experience. Unlike philosophies that promised to eliminate suffering or that viewed adversity as purely negative, Stoicism taught students to transform their relationship with difficulty and pain. They learned to see challenges not as obstacles to be avoided, but as opportunities for growth and development. This perspective was particularly powerful because it came from a teacher who had experienced extreme adversity firsthand and had demonstrably transformed it into wisdom and strength. Students could see in their teacher's own life proof that the philosophical principles they were learning actually worked under real-world conditions of the most challenging sort. Students practiced what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, learning to want only what was good and possible rather than constantly struggling against reality or pursuing goals that were ultimately beyond their control. This did not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather developing the ability to respond effectively to whatever circumstances arose without being emotionally devastated by outcomes beyond their control. The social impact of the school extended far beyond its immediate students and the local community of Nicopolis. Graduates carried Stoic principles into their careers in government, military service, business, education, and other spheres of influence, creating a network of like-minded individuals committed to virtue and wisdom. The ripple effects of their philosophical training touched countless other lives as these graduates applied Stoic principles to their leadership responsibilities and personal relationships. This widespread influence was particularly remarkable given Epictetus's humble origins and physical limitations. Here was a former enslaved person with a permanent disability who had become one of the most respected voices on practical wisdom and human flourishing in the entire Roman Empire. His success challenged conventional assumptions about who could possess and teach wisdom, demonstrating that virtue and insight were not limited to those born into privilege and education. The daily routine at the school reflected Epictetus's understanding that philosophical transformation required consistent practice rather than sporadic inspiration. Students rose before dawn for morning meditation and reflection, using this quiet time to prepare mentally and spiritually for the day ahead. They reviewed their goals and principles, considered the challenges they might face, and resolved to meet whatever circumstances arose with wisdom and virtue. The morning exercises often included what Epictetus called negative visualization, imagining potential losses or setbacks and practicing emotional responses that would maintain inner peace and clarity. Students might visualize losing their wealth, facing illness, experiencing criticism, or encountering other adversities. The goal was not to become pessimistic, but to reduce attachment to external goods and develop confidence in their ability to remain virtuous regardless of circumstances. After the morning preparation, students gathered for formal instruction that combined lecture, discussion, and interactive dialogue. Epictetus was masterful at using current events, personal anecdotes, and hypothetical scenarios to illustrate philosophical principles. He might begin with a student's report of a recent conflict with a family member, then use this concrete situation to explore broader themes about relationships, communication, forgiveness, and moral responsibility. The curriculum included regular practice sessions where students role-played difficult scenarios and received feedback on their responses. They might practice maintaining equanimity while being falsely accused, remaining calm during heated arguments, or making ethical decisions under pressure. These exercises helped bridge the gap between theoretical understanding and practical application, ensuring that philosophical insights would be available when most needed. The physical environment of the school was designed to support this intensive educational process. The main teaching areas were outdoors, following the tradition of ancient Greek philosophical schools, where learning took place in natural settings that reminded participants of their connection to the larger cosmos. Students and teachers gathered in groves of olive trees or in gardens where the beauty and tranquility of the natural setting enhanced their receptivity to wisdom and moral instruction. Indoor spaces were simple and unadorned, avoiding distractions that might interfere with serious study and reflection. The emphasis was on creating an atmosphere of simplicity, focus, and mutual respect that supported the challenging work of character development and moral education. Students learned that external luxury and elaborate decoration were not necessary for happiness or learning, and that simplicity often enhanced rather than diminished the quality of life and thought. The influence of these graduates extended far beyond their individual achievements and personal success. As they assumed positions of leadership in government, military service, business, and other fields, they brought Stoic values of integrity, rationality, and service to their work. Many became known for their ethical leadership, their ability to remain calm and effective under pressure, and their commitment to justice and the common good. One of the most famous graduates was Arrian himself, who not only preserved his teacher's words, but also became a distinguished historian and general. His military career demonstrated how Stoic principles could be applied effectively to leadership challenges, while his literary work showed how philosophical insights could be communicated to broader audiences. His Campaigns of Alexander became one of the most respected historical works of the ancient world, while his records of Epictetus's teachings ensured that future generations would have access to practical wisdom about human flourishing and moral development. The school's influence on family life was equally significant and enduring. Students learned to apply philosophical principles to marriage, child-rearing, and relationships with extended family members. They understood that their primary responsibility was to model virtue and wisdom in their personal relationships, creating homes that were centers of learning and moral development rather than merely places of comfort and entertainment. The approach to relationships that students learned was sophisticated and psychologically astute. They discovered that they could not control other people's choices, emotions, or behavior, but they could control their own responses to others' actions. This insight helped them avoid the manipulation, guilt, and resentment that often characterize dysfunctional relationships, instead developing healthier patterns of communication and mutual support. Students learned to see their family relationships as opportunities for practicing virtue rather than simply pursuing personal happiness or satisfaction. They understood that love was not primarily a feeling but a commitment to the welfare and development of others, and that this commitment required practical wisdom, emotional discipline, and moral courage. The influence on literary and intellectual culture was also profound and lasting. Students learned to appreciate poetry, drama, and history not merely as entertainment, but as sources of wisdom about human nature and moral development. They became discerning patrons of the arts, supporting works that elevated rather than degraded human consciousness and moral sensibility. The approach to wealth and material possessions that students learned had significant economic and social implications. They understood that money and property were tools to be used wisely rather than goals to be pursued for their own sake. This perspective led to more responsible spending, greater generosity toward those in need, and less anxiety about financial security. Many graduates became known for their philanthropy, not just in terms of monetary donations, but in their willingness to invest time and energy in helping others develop wisdom and virtue. They established schools, supported libraries, funded public works, and created institutions that served the common good rather than merely advancing their personal interests. The influence on political and social institutions was equally remarkable. Graduates who entered government service brought Stoic principles of justice, rational decision-making, and service to the common good to their administrative responsibilities. They became known for their incorruptibility, their ability to remain focused on long-term benefits rather than short-term political gains, and their commitment to the welfare of all citizens rather than just their particular constituencies. As Epictetus entered his later years, the school at Nicopolis had become one of the most respected centers of learning in the Roman Empire. Students continued to arrive from across the known world, drawn by his reputation for practical wisdom and effective teaching. Despite his advancing age and increasing physical limitations, he remained actively involved in the daily life of the school, continuing to teach and counsel students with the same energy and insight that had characterized his earlier years. The depth of affection and respect that students felt for their teacher was evident in their willingness to travel great distances for brief consultations and their lifelong commitment to practicing the principles he had taught them. Many established informal schools and study groups in their own communities, spreading Stoic insights to people who could never have accessed formal philosophical education. The preservation of his teaching through Arrian's careful documentation ensured that his insights would continue to benefit future generations long after his own death. The process of recording and organizing these teachings had been a collaborative effort between teacher and student, with Epictetus reviewing and refining the texts to ensure their accuracy and effectiveness for readers who had not had the benefit of personal instruction. The literary quality of the resulting works reflected not only Arrian's skill as a writer, but also Epictetus's deep understanding of how philosophical insights could be communicated most effectively to diverse audiences. The dialogues captured the spontaneous, interactive quality of his teaching, while preserving the logical structure and emotional depth that made his instruction so transformative. As news of these written records spread throughout the empire, demand for copies grew rapidly. The accessibility of Epictetus's teaching style made his philosophy particularly appealing to people who might have been intimidated by more abstract philosophical works. Busy administrators found practical guidance for the challenges of governance. Military officers discovered principles for maintaining morale and discipline under pressure, and ordinary citizens learned techniques for managing the stresses and uncertainties of daily life. The psychological sophistication of Epictetus's approach was particularly remarkable and influential for its time. His insights about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and behavior provided practical tools for mental health and emotional well-being that would not be formally recognized by psychology for many centuries. People who applied his techniques for managing anxiety, anger, and depression often experienced significant improvements in their quality of life and effectiveness. The cognitive methods he taught for identifying and challenging dysfunctional thought patterns were based on careful observation of how the human mind actually works under various conditions. Students learned to recognize the assumptions and interpretations that created unnecessary suffering, then to develop more accurate and helpful ways of understanding their experiences. This approach empowered individuals to take active responsibility for their emotional well-being rather than seeing themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control. As the end of Epictetus's life approached around 135 CE, he maintained the same equanimity and philosophical perspective that had characterized his response to every other major transition and challenge throughout his remarkable journey from slavery to respected wisdom teacher. His understanding of death as a natural process rather than an evil to be feared enabled him to face his own mortality with the same courage and wisdom he had taught his students to apply to their own difficulties. The final conversations between the aging teacher and his closest students were marked by deep affection, mutual respect, and shared commitment to the principles they had explored together over many years. These interactions demonstrated the profound bonds that could develop between people united by common dedication to wisdom and virtue, relationships that transcended the normal boundaries of age, social status, cultural background, and personal history. The preparation for succession that had been ongoing for several years ensured that the school would continue to operate effectively after its founder's death. The teachers who would carry forward the educational program had been carefully selected and trained not only in the intellectual content of Stoic philosophy, but also in the pedagogical methods that had proved most effective for promoting character development and practical wisdom. When Epictetus died, he had lived to see the transformation of a simple classroom in Nicopolis into one of the most influential centers of learning in the ancient world. Students from across the empire had carried his insights into their work as leaders, professionals, parents, and citizens, creating a network of influence that would continue to grow and spread long after his death. The legacy that Epictetus left behind was not merely a body of philosophical teachings, but a living demonstration of how human beings could transform the worst circumstances into opportunities for growth and service. His journey from slavery to respected teacher represented one of the most remarkable examples of personal development and social mobility in human history, proof that wisdom and virtue were available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary work of self-examination and character development. The influence of his teaching extended far beyond the immediate circle of students who had studied under him directly. The principles he had articulated and the methods he had developed for applying them to practical challenges continued to spread throughout the empire and beyond, reaching people who found in his insights practical guidance for their own struggles and aspirations. The preservation of his teaching through Arrian's careful documentation ensured that future generations would have access to the wisdom he had developed through years of careful observation, experimentation, and reflection. The literary quality of these records made them accessible to readers who might have been intimidated by more abstract philosophical works, while their practical focus made them useful for people facing the concrete challenges of daily life in any historical period. The influence of Epictetus continued to spread and evolve long after his death, touching the lives of countless individuals and shaping the development of intellectual, moral, and spiritual traditions that would endure for centuries. His teachings were preserved not only in formal philosophical texts, but also in the memories and practices of countless individuals who had been influenced by his insights either directly through personal contact or indirectly through the vast network of former students and their associates. During the later Roman period, as the empire faced increasing challenges from external invasions and internal decay, many people found in Stoic principles practical resources for maintaining dignity and purpose amid social chaos and uncertainty. The emphasis on personal virtue and inner strength that Epictetus had championed proved particularly valuable for people whose external circumstances were beyond their control. Early Christian thinkers found in his teachings about virtue, suffering, and inner transformation themes that resonated deeply with their own theological understanding, while disagreeing with certain aspects of classical philosophy. Many Christian authors drew on Stoic insights about emotional regulation, moral development, and practical wisdom while adapting these ideas to their own religious framework and spiritual values. The monastic movement that began in the 3rd and 4th centuries incorporated many practices that bore striking resemblance to the disciplines that Epictetus had developed for character formation and spiritual development. Monks and nuns used techniques for managing thoughts and emotions, practicing voluntary simplicity, and developing virtue that closely paralleled ancient Stoic methods, though they understood these practices within a Christian rather than classical philosophical context. The preservation of classical learning during the medieval period owed much to Christian scholars who recognized the value of ancient wisdom for moral and intellectual development. Monastery libraries carefully preserved copies of philosophical texts, including works by Epictetus, ensuring their survival through periods when classical culture was under severe threat from war, invasion, and social upheaval. Islamic philosophers also found value in Stoic insights about reason, virtue, and human development, incorporating these ideas into their own systematic approaches to knowledge and spiritual growth. The practical emphasis that had characterized Epictetus's teaching appealed to Islamic scholars who were interested in developing comprehensive approaches to both intellectual and moral education. The scholastic tradition that emerged during the medieval period drew heavily on the practical approach to ethics and psychology that Epictetus had pioneered. His methods for analyzing moral decisions, managing emotions, and developing character provided frameworks that medieval philosophers adapted to their own cultural and religious contexts, while preserving essential insights about human nature and moral development. The Renaissance saw humanist scholars rediscovering classical texts with renewed enthusiasm, finding in Epictetus's teachings about human dignity and potential powerful support for their conviction that individuals possessed remarkable capacities for growth and achievement. The emphasis on practical wisdom and character development that he had championed resonated with Renaissance ideals of human excellence and personal transformation. The printing press revolutionized the accessibility of his writings, making them available to audiences far beyond the scholarly and religious communities that had previously been their primary preservers. Merchants, craftsmen, and other members of the emerging middle class found in his teachings practical guidance for navigating the opportunities and challenges of an increasingly complex commercial society. The Protestant Reformation saw various reformers drawing on Stoic insights about personal responsibility, inner transformation, and the relationship between virtue and authentic spirituality. While they disagreed with certain aspects of classical philosophy, many found in Epictetus's emphasis on individual moral development and practical wisdom themes that supported their theological convictions about personal faith and ethical living. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was influenced by the approach to rational inquiry and systematic observation that Stoic philosophy had promoted. Scientists and philosophers like Francis Bacon drew on classical insights about the importance of careful observation, logical analysis, and intellectual humility in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of natural phenomena. The Age of Enlightenment saw philosophers across Europe rediscovering classical insights about reason, virtue, and human nature with unprecedented systematic rigor. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Kant found in Stoic philosophy sophisticated approaches to ethics and psychology that influenced their own investigations of human knowledge and moral development. The emphasis on rational analysis combined with practical application that had characterized Epictetus's approach provided models for philosophical inquiry that shaped the development of modern moral philosophy and political theory. The political revolutions of the 18th century drew inspiration from classical ideas about human dignity, natural rights, and the relationship between individual virtue and social justice. Both the American and French revolutions reflected Stoic insights about the fundamental equality of human beings and the importance of founding political institutions on rational principles rather than mere tradition or arbitrary authority. The founding fathers of the American Republic were deeply influenced by classical philosophy, with figures like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson drawing extensively on Stoic insights about leadership, civic virtue, and the relationship between personal character and effective governance. The constitutional framework they created reflected many principles that could be traced back to classical philosophical understanding of human nature and social organization. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century created new challenges and opportunities that tested the continued relevance of ancient philosophical insights under dramatically changed social and economic conditions. Workers facing the demands of factory life, entrepreneurs building new businesses, and social reformers addressing the problems of rapid urbanization all found in Stoic principles practical guidance for maintaining dignity and purpose amid dramatic social change. The abolitionist movement drew powerful inspiration from Epictetus's example as someone who had experienced slavery directly yet had transformed that experience into wisdom and strength rather than bitterness and resentment. His demonstration that circumstances could not ultimately determine character provided moral support for those working to end slavery and establish genuine equality of opportunity for all people regardless of race or background. The women's rights movement similarly found inspiration in his teaching that virtue and wisdom were available to all human beings regardless of their social status or circumstances. His emphasis on the fundamental equality of human nature in terms of capacity for moral and intellectual development provided philosophical support for arguments about women's education and political participation. The Civil War period in American history saw many people turning to Stoic principles for guidance in enduring the enormous suffering and disruption that characterized that conflict. Military leaders on both sides drew on classical insights about courage, duty, and maintaining moral principles under extreme pressure, while civilians coping with loss and uncertainty found in Stoic techniques for managing grief and maintaining hope, practical resources for psychological survival and recovery. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of psychology as a systematic scientific discipline, with researchers beginning to investigate empirically many phenomena that ancient philosophers had explored through careful observation and practical experimentation. The cognitive insights that Epictetus had developed about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and behavior proved remarkably accurate when subjected to scientific investigation, validating approaches to emotional regulation and behavior change that he had pioneered. The world wars of the 20th century provided extreme tests of the psychological and moral resources that Stoic philosophy had traditionally sought to develop. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders facing unprecedented challenges found in classical insights about courage, endurance, and maintaining humanity under dehumanizing circumstances practical tools for psychological and moral survival that enabled them to preserve their dignity and effectiveness under the most extreme conditions. The Holocaust and other genocidal atrocities of the 20th century created urgent interest in philosophical approaches that could help people maintain dignity and meaning even in the most extreme circumstances. Survivors and scholars found in Epictetus's example powerful evidence that inner freedom remained possible even under conditions of total external control, and that the human spirit possessed remarkable capacities for endurance and transcendence. The post-war period saw a growing interest in psychological approaches to trauma, resilience, and post-traumatic growth. Researchers discovered that many techniques for recovery and healing that had been developed by modern psychology closely paralleled methods that ancient philosophers like Epictetus had pioneered for managing adversity and developing emotional strength. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew inspiration from classical examples of dignity under oppression and transformation through principled action. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. found in Stoic philosophy insights about nonviolent resistance, moral courage, and the relationship between personal virtue and social change that influenced their strategies and sustained their commitment during difficult struggles for justice and equality. The development of cognitive behavioral therapy in the latter half of the 20th century represented perhaps the most direct rediscovery of techniques that Epictetus had pioneered centuries earlier. Therapists learned to help clients identify and challenge dysfunctional thought patterns, develop more effective coping strategies, and take greater responsibility for their emotional well-being using methods that closely paralleled ancient Stoic practices. Modern research in neuroscience and psychology has continued to validate insights that Epictetus developed about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Brain imaging studies show that cognitive techniques for emotional regulation actually change neural pathways in ways that support greater psychological resilience and well-being, providing scientific confirmation for practices he had developed through careful observation and practical experience. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the relevance of Epictetus's insights seems to grow rather than diminish. The rapid pace of technological change, the complexity of global challenges, and the psychological demands of modern life create a greater need than ever for the kind of practical wisdom and emotional resilience that his philosophy has always sought to develop. The increasing recognition that mental health and psychological well-being are as important as physical health has brought renewed attention to classical approaches to human flourishing that have always emphasized the integration of mind and body, thought and action, individual development, and social responsibility. Educational institutions around the world have begun incorporating mindfulness, character education, and practical philosophy programs that draw heavily on classical insights about human development and moral formation, recognizing that effective education requires attention to the whole person rather than just intellectual development. As global society continues to grapple with unprecedented challenges requiring both technological innovation and moral wisdom, the teachings of Epictetus provide resources that are both ancient and thoroughly contemporary. His insights about human nature, social responsibility, and the conditions necessary for authentic flourishing offer guidance that is as relevant to addressing climate change and artificial intelligence as it is to managing personal relationships and career decisions. The story of Epictetus reminds us that human beings possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, growth, and transformation regardless of their starting circumstances or external limitations. His journey from the degradation of slavery to the dignity of philosophical teaching demonstrates that circumstances need not determine destiny, and that wisdom can emerge from the most unpromising beginnings. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive journey through the extraordinary life of Epictetus, the enslaved man who became philosophy's most practical teacher. His story reminds us that true freedom and dignity are not gifts that others can give or take away, but achievements that each individual can claim through the disciplined development of wisdom and virtue. In our own time of rapid change and uncertainty, his insights offer both practical tools for daily challenges and profound hope for human transformation and flourishing. If you found this exploration of ancient wisdom and human resilience meaningful and inspiring, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from history that illuminate the timeless possibilities and challenges of human existence. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're listening from as we share this moment of reflection across distance and time, continuing the conversation that began in that simple classroom in ancient Nicopolis over 19 centuries ago. Until our next journey into the rich history of human experience and wisdom, may you find your own path to the freedom that no external force can ever take away.